Just one there. I don't think there is a. Oh, one here, right? One seat is available. Two. One here and one there. This is still available, right? Okay. Yeah. Sir, one is right here. So nobody's sitting here? Nobody's sitting? Okay. Right here. Thank you. Mike, thanks for coming. Your seat is right there on the left-hand side, as I have at the head table. So I think we have only one seat left, right there. Yeah, it's done. So only chairs can be brought. Yes, sir. We keep the doors open.
Well, I have 1 o'clock, and it's a full house, which we're not surprised by. I'm Dr. Jack Kim, the Dean of Academics for the Command General Staff College, and Chief Academic Officer for Army University. Might have to do something. And once again, I'm Jack Kim, the Dean of Academics for CGSC and the Chief Academic Officer for Army University. And believe it or not, we scheduled this thing several weeks ago, but it's a ripe topic, obviously. We are now living the ancient Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. For the international order that existed since the end of World War II, much has changed in the last 8 days. President Biden stated in his State of Union address on Tuesday night, Russia's Vladimir Putin sought to shake the foundations of the free world, thinking he could make it bend to his menacing ways, but he badly miscalculated. He thought he could roll into Ukraine and the world would roll over. Instead, he met with a wall of strength he never anticipated or imagined. He met the Ukrainian people. From President Zelensky to every Ukrainian, their fearlessness, their courage, their determination literally inspires the world. Groups of citizens blocking tanks with their bodies, everyone from students to retirees to teachers turned soldiers defending their homeland. On Tuesday morning, just before the State of the Union address, the Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky gave a speech to the European Parliament that was so powerful that the translator choked up with emotion. Some of you may have seen that. President Zelensky concluded the speech with the following: "Do prove that you are with us. Do prove that you will not let us go. Do prove that you indeed are Europeans, and then life will win over death, and light will win over darkness. Glory be to the Ukraine." Yesterday morning, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution in an emergency session reprimanding Russia for its actions and demanding a withdrawal of forces. The vote on this resolution was an overwhelming 141 to 5, with 35 abstentions. Only Russia, Belarus, Syria, North Korea, and Eritrea opposed the measures. Russia, especially Vladimir Putin, don't have many friends today. It's also not a good day to be a Russian oligarch with a large yacht. The international response in support of Ukraine has been overwhelming. Surprisingly, military aid is coming from countries such as Germany, Sweden, and Finland, all representing changes in their defense policies. Even Switzerland has imposed economic sanctions. China has been cautious in their response to the situation. Yet, Ukraine is not part of NATO, so Article 5 does not apply. Aid is coming, but not direct support on the ground. We all watch to see the battle from the distance. Our response at the Command and General Staff College is to continue focusing our efforts on Russia as an imminent threat and China as a pacing threat to our national security, to enhancing our understanding of these two adversaries' motivations and strategies. We have in the past year conducted a series of sessions and will continue to do a series of faculty development seminars and professional forums. Today's panel is CASO's fourth in that direction. So the topic of the CASO panel today is Russia-Ukraine conflict, implications for Euro-Atlantic security, and Sino-American relationships. Our panel is sponsored by the United States Army Culture and Area Studies Office, or CASO, of the Command and General Staff College, and conducted in conjunction with the U.S. Army Combined Arms Center, International Liaison Program, and CGSC. Our session today includes 4 panelists: Lieutenant Colonel Frank of the German Army, Dr. Mark Wilcox of the Department of Joint Interagency and Multinational Operations, Dr. John Modinger, also from the Department of Joint Interagency and Multinational Operations, and Lieutenant Colonel Paul Aldaya from the Department of Joint Interagency and Multinational Operations. The complete bios of these panel members can be accessed on the CASO website once we're allowed to post it. This event is open to all military and civilian employees at Fort Leavenworth here in person only today. Per installation health protection procedures, masks must still be worn indoors unless you're the speaker right now. That was a joke. The opinions and discussion points during this session are those of the speakers and the moderator and do not necessarily represent official positions of the United States government or respective partner governments. After the initial remarks for about 7 minutes, our panelists will jointly answer your questions and reply to your comments. Our moderator today is Dr. Mahir Ibrahimov, or Dr. I, who is the director of the Cultural and Area Studies Office, United States Army Command and General Staff College. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this session over to Dr. I, who will continue moderating throughout the session. Thank you for being here today.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, sir, for your support. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our next CASO session. Next slide, please. As we continue closely following the regional and global geopolitics, obviously the Russia-Ukraine crisis has been lately dominating the international relations and the world media. In order to continue staying relevant, we promised during our last session to address this very pertinent and timely topic, its potential implications for Euro-Atlantic security, as well as the Sino-American relationships. This slide depicts the background of the conflict, as well as the positions of the major players. Early 90s breakup of the Soviet Union, US and Russia worked with Ukraine to denuclearize it in exchange for security assurances. April 2008, NATO Bucharest Summit Declaration, Ukraine's and Georgia's accession to NATO is welcomed. 2014, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula. 2014, self-proclaimed Luhansk and Donetsk republics of Donbass. Russia's position. NATO stopped its eastward expansion and denied membership to Ukraine. NATO rolled back troop deployment in countries that had joined after 1997. US-NATO position. NATO's open door policy. Sovereign countries can choose their own security alliances. Giving in to Russia's demands would hand the Kremlin veto power over NATO's decision-making. It would have implications for the continent's security. China's position. China's foreign minister Wang Yi called Russia's security concerns, quote, legitimate, they should be taken seriously and addressed, end of quote. China's official line has been cautious, stopping short of actual support for Russia using military force. Next slide, please. Let's consider some potential outcomes of the Russia-Ukraine crisis that had existed prior to the invasion. Option 1. Russia is persuaded that the human casualties, the economic sanctions, and the diplomatic fallout would be too great. Fear the West might support an insurgency in Ukraine, costly war for Russia, similar to the situation in the invasion of Afghanistan in 79-89, for example. Putin is potentially convinced that these implications would reduce his domestic support and even threaten his power. Russia would unlikely accept this scenario, since it would not prevent NATO's expansion. Option 2. Ukraine and Russia could revive the Minsk agreements, 2014 and 15. The Minsk Protocol, or the so-called Normandy format, set up by French, German, Russian, and Ukrainian diplomats to end the war between the Ukrainian government forces and Russian-backed rebels in Donbass. Since the fighting continued, it obviously failed. Option 3, Ukraine is to become neutral. No NATO membership could be satisfactory for Russia, but likely unacceptable for Ukraine and West. Option 4, status quo. Russia continues its relatively low-cost support of pro-Russia rebels in Donbass and its destabilizing impact on Ukraine's politics and economy. Putin's calculation, countries with civil unrest would unlikely be provided membership in NATO or EU. This map in the bottom of the corner, depicts the Russian permanent troops, newly deployed, as well as part of the military exercises in Belarus, right here, from multiple locations. According to the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, Russia had deployed 30,000 combat troops, elite Spetsnaz units, Su-35 fighter jets, and S-400 missile defense systems. Per other sources, Iskander missile launchers and other weaponry were part of the arsenal. In total, there were 135,000 Russian troops on Ukraine's border prior to the invasion from multiple locations. Belarus, Russia proper, if anybody knows the Russian geography, so including in the Voronezh, Rostov, and Kursk regions of Russia, Crimea and Transnistria of Moldova, positioning themselves for an assault on Ukraine. Okay, this is all multiple locations. Next slide, please. This slide depicts the comparison. Actually, this map shows the areas of Russian control as of too much. And my understanding, if anybody has latest, Russians managed to take over Kherson, control of Kherson, which is, if I remember correctly, it's about 144,000 population. And this is the port city, similar to Mariupol. Okay? So this is the first major city they managed to take control of. And I think it happened overnight. Next slide, please. This slide depicts the comparison of the military capabilities of Ukraine and Russia prior to the invasion. The bottom percentage, right here, and dollar amount shows the military spending of both respective governments' overall spending. It's not like military spending per national GDP, just to make sure that it's not confused with that. It's just the percentage and dollar amount per overall government spending, if that makes sense to everybody. Okay? Okay? Next slide, please. With this, and without further ado, I would like to yield the floor to Lieutenant Colonel Frank, who will provide German perspective, which has a long shared history with Russia. He will discuss how the ruthless violation of Ukraine's sovereignty has created a precedent to demonstrate Germany's dedication to defend and preserve freedom, human rights, and peace in the Euro-Atlantic area. Colonel Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to be here. I was really surprised that I was invited to this panel, as I'm definitely not a Russian expert. You can tell from my uniform, I'm just an average soldier, which has some experience in NATO. I've got some experience in my own army, and as a German national, I can provide you my own personal opinion on those events unfolding. I've been reminded a couple of times about well, how timing is important, and well, that plays into one of the German paradigms. So apart from lacking humor at all, as a German, there's two paradigms we follow. That one is being efficient, and the other one is being punctual. So I'll also try to keep in that 7 minutes time frame. When talking about Russia and Europe in its total, and also Ukraine, and what's going on in Europe, we have to think about various aspects and facets of the things. And looking back into the middle of the last century, I think Churchill once quoted correctly, Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And I think he highlights a very important point. When talking about any nation, there's always so many perspectives. It's all about perception. And what I'd like to do is offer you my perception of things, and also from time to time maybe highlight some of the perceptions maybe Russia has. And I'm sure that my other panelists will also help us provide those different perspectives to maybe come to a conclusion in the end. So I'd like to talk to you about some of the history, shared history of Europe, especially Germany and Russia, Ukraine, and also Eastern Europe, as well as continue with the German policy and maybe the German approach. Finally, coming up to the way ahead. What can we do? What should we do? And maybe there's some limits to what we can do. When we're talking history, it's always hard to guess and define when actually are we talking about Russia, when are we talking about Germany, when are we talking about any nation in Europe, because, well, it was always a big mix. And only as a German, my nation as it is very young. Compared to the United States, we're only 30 years old, as it is right now. But that doesn't change that we have a long history where our nations, our cultures have interacted. It's all about the cultures who were mixed. When we're talking back Russo-German relationships, or for its part, Russian-German-Ukrainian relationships, we're looking at, it starts at 900 AD. So back then, it was not Germans, it was Ottons running parts of Germany, what is now called Germany, and they were closely connected to the Kiev Rus. So just hearing about the Kiev Rus, well, they're not Russians, they were not Ukrainians, they were the Kiev Rus. It's different, but geographically similar area. How were they related? By trade, and continuing on with family ties, because there was nobility. Nobility, what did they do during that time? They married, and they traded and married, divorced, and fought. In summary, when we're looking into the history, it continued like that. It intensified in the 15th century when Germany somewhat gained more power, and also in Russia, the Grand Duchy of Moscow rose. And we intensified those ties, and wars were more apparent. But all through that time, we had merchant relationships. And even, I'd like to draw your attention to another period of European history, and that's dualism. That's back in the days when Prussia and Austria were so busy fighting each other that actually the Russians were standing up and trying to be something like an honest broker, from time to time managing peace in Europe. Different perspective, different times. But then also Napoleon came, and the Germans for its part, always attacking eastwards. So in the perception of the Russians, whenever they were afraid, most of the time it came from the West. It's a perspective we have to at least acknowledge. That brings me to the next part. The German perspective, the German approach, and, well, for me, it was the biggest paradigm change in Germany this Sunday. I never believed that this could happen when I am still in the military, but apparently our government came to a decision how we're approaching our approach to peace in Europe, for democracy, and our values, and how eager we are to defend them. The German paradigm is still and will remain never again, never alone. That is our obligation towards history. We owe that, not only to our direct neighbors, we owe that to Europe, but we also owe that to the world. Because Germany does know what it means to be an invader, what it means to inflict harm upon the world, and suddenly capture the entire world in a war. That's why you have to understand that is what guides us. Never again, never alone. The part of never alone is important to understand. We will never operate unilaterally. And I think you cannot. In this modern world, it is all about us, not me. When we're talking about alliances, European Union, NATO, United Nations, but also in Europe, like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, are important. And that's the power tools Germany likes to use. So whenever you see Germany being very limited in their bilateral approach, that's because we're putting all our effort into those allied approaches. When you see the dual track approach on this map, on this slide, what are we talking about? It's all about deterrence, but also dialogue. Yes, Germany believes you have to be strong, you have to be powerful. You have to hold that sword in one hand to show your enemy that you can use that sword and actually inflict harm. But that's only the ticket in to conduct talks, to understand those different perspectives and come to a conclusion, and then finally maybe achieving peace and prosperity for what it's worth. So how should we do that in the future? We believe in 5 different fields we have to be involved. Basically, it's like a whole of government approach. We have to use all the instruments of power, and military just being one of them. You can see deterrence and dialogue. We have talked about that already. Cohesion. I've always laughed when I was working in NATO HQ and we were talking about the center of gravity for NATO being this cohesion of the alliance. As a military, it sounds rather soft. But what the past week has shown us is how strong suddenly that cohesion was. And even though Russia has spent years and years to destroy that cohesion of the alliance, they didn't manage it. Investing in different separatist parties all over Europe didn't manage to create that breach within the alliance, not even with the countries. And that is a strong point. Economy. Germany is a strong economic power. Therefore, economy is always our sharpest sword. But now, with the paradigm change, what my government just launched, tripling our defense budget, promising to go way beyond 2% for the coming years, I think that's something we've shown what could be done. To end with, within my 7 minutes, China, just to make the link to the future, well, it's all about the big power competition. China and Russia, even though they're very different, they're not alike, and we can apply similar rules to that conflict, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel Frank, for the great presentation. We really appreciate that. So initial planning was that Colonel Michael Kopp, our liaison officer to Combined Arms Center, would be the panel member, but he had to go on TDY unexpectedly or expectedly, so I think. And Colonel Frank kindly agreed to be a panel member today, and we were sure he would do equally great job with today's session. Thank you so much. Just a quick point about the Kievan rules, which existed, which Colonel Frank mentioned in, just for your information, if you are not aware, 9th century AD. And the first ruler of that state was, by the way, his name was Volodymyr. The grand, in Russian it's Великий князь, would be in English like grand, whatever. How would you translate knyaz? There's no translation, right? Any Russian speakers? Like grand Dutch, maybe? Or grand king, or something like that. So, but that's a different reality of different culture. So that was the first ruler of that entity, Kievan Rus, 9th century. Now, next slide, please. The next speaker is Dr. Mark Wilcox, who will describe the Euro-Atlantic security system and its major components, and to explore how they might change as a post-Cold War security architecture emerges. That's another interesting topic. Dr. Wilcox, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Guy. I appreciate it. And thank you, Colonel Frank, for your comments. I'm not going to go quite as far back in history as you did, but we will go back a little bit because I think what we're looking at right now is, and next slide, please, the kind of the essence of what's going on is a challenge to the security environment in Europe. One arguably could say that a cause from the Russian perspective for what's going on is the current security environment in Europe. And I think certainly from a Western perspective, it's a challenge to a security environment that seems to have done pretty well, not just since 1991, but going back even earlier than that. It's interesting, one of Putin's goals, you could argue, is go back to security environment, say, before 1997. If you listen to some of his speeches, it might be go back to the security environment at the end of the Russian Empire, around 1919 or so. So we're not going to go quite that far back, but what I do is talk a little bit about what the European security system is, identified what I see as some components of it, and as I go through that, talk about what are some of the changes that we might see occurring in that security system. Slide, please. Starting with the OSCE, and Colonel Frank mentioned the OSCE is the body of choice for a number of countries, 57 of them actually, in terms of dealing with European and Eurasian security. Yeah, and surprisingly, you may think, the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, it's not just Europe. It's Europe, the former Soviet Union, the United States, Canada, and even little Mongolia, way out in Asia as well. It's quite a spread. And in terms of the scope of what it does, it embraces basically three dimensions: military security, the human dimension, and an economic and environmental dimension, a concept that we call comprehensive security. And basically what the OSCE does, and it's kind of its bread and butter, it sets norms and standards for conduct. And these norms and standards go back to 1975 in the Helsinki Final Act and what they call the Decalogue. There are actually 10 standards that are set. And a number of them would seem either relevant or in gross breach at this point right now, including sovereign equality, respects for the rights inherent in sovereignty, refraining from threat or use of force, inviolability of frontiers, territorial integrity of states, peaceful settlement of disputes. Those would seem to be under a bit of challenge these days. And these are all commitments that all states that belong to the OSCE have signed up for. Even though they're politically binding, they are supposed to govern conduct in the European space. And another critical thing that the OSCE does within the acquis of the OSCE is arms control, conventional arms control. Under three agreements: the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, which the Russians they suspended in 2007, which you can't even do, but they did it anyway. The Treaty on Open Skies, which the United States withdrew from last year, and then the Russians subsequently withdrew from it as well. And the Vienna Document on Confidence and Security Building Measures, which is still in effect and provides a series of politically binding measures to help constrain military activities, and particularly for openness and transparency. Those are not functioning very well either. The Russian Federation has basically rejected the use of those mechanisms. So that's the OSCE. We then have the West, as I call it. First is obviously NATO, and one of Putin's complaints is the security environment has become too NATO-centric. Enlargement or expansion, depending on your perspective, is a major problem for the Russians. It's not a problem for those who have joined NATO. As has been pointed out, NATO expansion was not driven by NATO. It was driven by the demand of countries looking for security. A major issue there has been the 2% budget commitment for allies, which the Germans are now getting more on board with. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. But we do see NATO actually functioning in the current environment. We see enhanced forward presence units in the Baltics and Poland. We now see, although not necessarily under NATO, but more bilaterally, a battle group moving into Slovakia. And we see consultations under Article 4 of the treaty, which recently took place to help plan a NATO response. And last but certainly not least, a key part of NATO is the U.S. nuclear umbrella. which remains and may become more part of the conversation now as Putin waves around his nuclear weapons. As for the European Union, that's certainly where we see a lot of economic and political heft, as I say on the slide. Again, 27 states, 447 million people, third largest economy in the world after China and the United States, 15% of world trade. But I would say is an underdeveloped military component. I didn't realize this, but so I dug into the treaties, realized there is actually a collective defense provision for the European Union. It'll be interesting to see how that develops as this particular station moves on. As we move on to Russia and their friends, we have the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which I'm not going to talk about a lot because I believe Colonel Aldaya is going to address it. Just note the recent Russian intervention in Kazakhstan with the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And the peacekeeping forces, quote unquote, that are in the Nagorno-Karabakh right now, primarily led by the Russian Federation. And this is how Russia basically exerts military influence over a number of states in the region. There's also the Union State of Russia and Belarus, kind of a little known phenomenon. But in 1999, Russia and Belarus signed a treaty to become a union state. It didn't really develop very much, but has picked up a lot more interest lately. And most we've seen that in some very large military exercises that have taken place in Belarus, both in September of 2001 and the most recent one in 2022. I think a lot of Russian soldiers who were in Ukraine actually thought the exercise was still going on when they went to Ukraine, and were surprised when people started firing back at them. But it's also worth noting that in November of 2021, Russia and Belarus signed 28 agreements on deeper integration of their countries within the Union State. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that President Lukashenko of Belarus has found his internal position to be somewhat under threat after his latest round of fraudulent elections, and has had to lean more and more on Putin and the Russians to keep him afloat. Slide, please. Next group I'll touch on really quick are the neutrals, Finland and Sweden. And I think this is where we're seeing some very interesting developments on the security architecture. Both, of course, are neutral. Finland, although don't ever use the term with them, was Finlandized during the period of the Soviet Union because of their unique geographical position with a 1,300-kilometer border with the USSR. But both have cooperated with NATO, primarily under Partnership for Peace, but both have remained outside of NATO. What we've seen, though, is some polling that indicates more support. For instance, in 2019, 19% of Finns favored NATO membership. In 2022, it's up to 53%, to the point that the Finnish government is actually discussing it within their parliament. Sweden has always had a bit higher level, generally in the mid-40% for membership in NATO, but even now we're seeing them expressing more interest in at least discussing joining the alliance, to which the Russian Foreign Ministry made some rather less than veiled threats about what would happen should they join the alliance. So we have the neutrals there. And then last, but certainly not least, is the United States, that transatlantic linkage as part of the European security architecture. The U.S. force posture obviously has been reduced significantly since the end of the Cold War. However, what we're seeing now are conversations going on within the Congress and apparently within the administration about, do we need to relook U.S. force posture in Europe in terms of both permanent and rotational forces? And in fact, Mara Karlin, who's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities, told a congressional committee the other day that the administration is relooking the global posture review that was just completed to examine, do we need to change our force posture in Europe? And again, the U.S., of course, brings the nuclear umbrella to the table. And I'll take just a couple more seconds with a late-breaking update, and that's the Little Arctic Council. Yes, the Arctic is part of the European security architecture. Russia has the presidency of the Arctic Council right now. And just today, the United States, allies, Sweden, and Finland all came forward and saying, we are not going to participate in any meetings in the Russian Federation and the Arctic Council, and have basically brought that organization to a halt right now. So we see as a rather varied structure, but I think some definite ongoing changes, and I would certainly be happy to entertain comments or questions about that. Dr. Ai, back to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilcox, for very interesting analysis. It was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. Our next speaker is Dr. John Modinger, who will articulate on the Russia-Ukraine situation and its linkages to the Sino-American and Sino-Russian relationships. Dr. Modinger, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming this afternoon. I wasn't sure I was going to be on this panel, to be honest with you, when it started, because I wasn't sure of the connection to the specific issue. Yes, I could see connections, but I thought it was a mistake to push that too hard. But has become evident over the last week or so, a lot of people are thinking about the connections to China and the Taiwan issue and what the Chinese might infer from what's going on between Russia and Ukraine right now. Next slide. And so that's why I decided to go ahead and join the panel. So,
And Doctor, I
thank you.
convince you.
Next slide. But having said that, yes, there are similarities between the two situations, but there are also distinct differences between them. Both Xi and Putin see the United States as the primary obstacle to their more grandiose dreams and ambitions going forward. They would like to see a world in which America is not primarily calling most of the shots. That's an objective for both. Obviously, China has much more power than Russia does to affect some of that longer term, except for the fact that Russia is a huge nuclear power, so it's always going to be in the fold with regard to that. Both China and Russia see the United States or its leader, Biden, as weak right now. And some have postulated that this might not have happened under a different leader. We're never going to know the answer to that, but I think it's a fairly dubious assumption, to be honest with you. I think this has been percolating for quite some time, and who's in charge necessarily in Washington, while important, was not necessarily going to be definitive with regard to how this played itself out. Both essentially, Russia and China would like to have a sphere of influence, and in this day and age, spheres of influence is kind of a non-PC term, but in fact the United States has, for all intents and purposes, had its own sphere of influence for roughly the last 200 years. It's called Central and South America, okay? Codified under the Monroe Doctrine. But we live in different times now, and of course, spheres of influence would run headlong into important U.S. interests, and so the United States is looking to play down any talk about spheres of influence going forward. And they both seek a return to greatness. Putin is attempting to cobble together what some say is a modified version or a slenderized version of the old Soviet Union. Maybe so, but we know for a fact that he bemoans the collapse of the Soviet Union, sees it as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And presumably this is one step to recapturing some of that grandeur. And right now it's not looking too good for him in that regard. With regard to China, 2049 is not too far away. 2049 will be the centennial of the coming to power of the Communist Party in China. Many see that as, you know, the finish line, if you would, for completion of a lot of things to attain this Chinese dream, okay? And that dream includes retaking any territorial losses from the past. So obviously that's where Taiwan comes into it. The American policy since 1971 has basically been one China, okay? Taiwan is part of China. That's been our policy, but we've also had this policy of strategic ambiguity with regard to Taiwan. Will we come to their defense in the instance of a Chinese attempt to take it? We want the Chinese to think we will. We want the Taiwanese to maybe have a few doubts about that, so that they don't get too ambitious with their calls for independence potentially. I'll tell you that most Taiwanese have no desire whatsoever for independence. They would like to maintain the status quo. There's a very small percentage, maybe like 4 or 5%, that would like to see reunification with China. And then there's another percentage that does favor independence, but compared to those that favor the status quo, it's fairly small. So those are some of the similarities. Some of the differences. Russia is an immediate challenge, but China, as was said earlier, is a pace-setting challenge or a longer-term challenge. China has significant future potential. It's more than likely within the next 5 years or so, China will overtake the United States to have the largest economy in the world. That scares and shocks a lot of Americans, but if you think about it, it's a population 4 times the size of the United States that has an economy that's just now beginning to come up alongside the United States economy. So I don't think we should be overly concerned about that. But keep in mind that with a larger gross domestic product, they can devote more to their defense establishment, which gives people pause. But then don't forget that this is a country that is getting older faster than it's getting richer, okay? So all these double-digit increases you're seeing with regard to defense outlays and stuff, this will not persist in all likelihood in the future. It can't, because the working pool is shrinking and the age of pool is growing. And they don't have anything approaching our Social Security system or something like that. But it's going to have to take place. Two generations, rather, of one-child policy has made it so that this is a principal problem for them going forward. And let me just get to the last slide here real quick, because I see Mahir standing up there, and I don't want to eat up too much more time. The relationships are quite different, so comparing them is problematic. In my personal opinion, the United States has actually done a fairly good job in the Ukraine crisis with regard to its diplomacy, its actions and whatnot vis-a-vis Russia. China's looking at this, and it's thinking about how this might play out in a Taiwanese scenario. I think it's fair to say that while it hasn't changed China's overall calculus about getting Taiwan back one way or another, it has given them pause with regard to the panoply of economic sanctions that are now pressing Russia. Those sanctions are going to press Russia brutally in the next few weeks. We're only starting to see everything lock up right now and seize up, but you're going to potentially see Russia default in the not too distant future because of all of these economic sanctions. With regard to Taiwan itself, quite frankly, Taiwan has not gotten serious about its own security thus far. There's rhetoric to the contrary, certainly by the Taiwanese government, but from where I stand, the population appears to be far less concerned than the government is about its future. They are banking on American intervention should that come to pass between China and Taiwan. I don't know precisely why they're banking on that. Things like our recent exit from Afghanistan might cause them to recalculate that a little, but the population clearly suspects that those security guarantees will kick in later. I think the government is a little more realistic about that. But in the event that the U.S. government, receives a lot of pressure to make a more definitive stand with regard to Taiwan, I put the 50-year policy of strategic ambiguity aside and come up with a policy that more acclimates to strategic clarity as opposed to strategic ambiguity. I would tell you, I think the U.S. would be foolish to do so with regard to Taiwan. Foolish to do it. Until that time that Taiwan clearly and unmistakably demonstrates its commitment to its own long-term security. Right now, I just don't see it. I just don't see it. And you know, if we've learned anything in the last couple of decades about allies and partners that either lack the capability and or will to fight for their own survival or to make the necessary changes to make success a possibility, then that's a bad investment for the United States. And I'm not saying this strictly from a monetary perspective. I'm saying this from a holistic perspective. It's a bad investment for the United States. We have to be concerned with return on investment, and I mean that in a holistic sense. If we're going to put troops on the ground at some point in the future in Taiwan, then we have to see, I think, significant sacrifice and pain on the part of Taiwan before that should happen. Because if they're not willing to do those things, then why should we think of asking Americans to do those things? There are accommodations that could be made to help them. In the 1960s, for instance, Singapore developed a poison shrimp strategy vis-a-vis potential opponents. Idea being, make yourself so unappetizing and indigestible to potential enemies that they won't think about going there. Taiwan can probably adopt the same type of strategy, but it's going to have to coordinate to do that, okay? With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mahir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Modinger, for very informative presentation. So, next slide, please. At this time, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Aldaya will discuss how Russia continues to use international and regional organizations in an attempt to provide legitimacy for actions in various countries of the former Soviet Union. Colonel Aldaya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. I, Dr. Kim, Mr. Johnson, distinguished panel members and guests. I'm honored to be here today to talk about this extremely timely and important topic with you today. Not a Russia expert by any means, but I've been fortunate enough to spend a good amount of time over the last decade studying the area and its so-called near abroad. In 2014, I spent 10 months in Kiev working at the embassy there, split between our Office of Defense Cooperation and our Defense Threat Reduction Agency office there. While there, I also witnessed the opening of our Joint Multinational Training Group Ukraine, or JMTGU, mission in Yavoriv in the western part of Ukraine. I also witnessed the intense dedication and patriotism of the Ukrainian people who rallied in support of moving their country towards the west and away from their Soviet past by ousting the former president Viktor Yanukovych. So to me, it's really no surprise the sense of duty displayed by Ukrainians 8 years later now as they continue to repel the onslaught of a Russian attack on their sovereign nation. Following my assignment in Kiev, I was able to go to Uzbekistan for 2 years, where I, during the midst of President Mirziyoyev's shift to the west, again away from Russia. And then my most recent posting was in UCOM, or as a South Caucasus desk officer from 19 to 21, so during the most recent Nagorno-Karabakh war, and then also the Russia desk officer for the last 5 months of my tour. Both of these positions, I observed Russia's strong desire to maintain their supremacy through their so-called sphere of influence. Like many of the comments already made by my distinguished colleagues, I'm going to focus mine on what I think are overarching themes rather than specifically on the events that have transpired over the last 10 days. Chiefly among these, as Dr. I alluded to, is Russia's, or specifically President Putin's, view of international coalitions, alliances, agreements, and how these play into his decision-making process. Next slide, please. So as Dr. Wilcox also alluded to, since the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and long before, Russian leaders have continuously cited various OSCE documents, in order to justify their own actions in Ukraine while crying foul towards EU and NATO expansion. For example, in a letter to Western nations sent early last month, Foreign Minister Lavrov made reference to the Istanbul Charter of 1999, chastising Western leaders for selectively adhering to, quote, only those elements that suit them, namely the right of states to be free to choose alliances for ensuring exclusively their own security. He then goes on to not comment on what he views as NATO's aspiration to bypass the UN Security Council in order to use force when and where they see fit. So based on this logic, combined with Russia's recent veto on the Council's resolution for Moscow to cease its attack on Ukraine, it would appear that Russia too feels it can now bypass the UN completely. In line with Putin's efforts to sow disunity across NATO and the EU, Russia continued to push for bilateral talks rather than multilateral engagements with the West leading up to the events that transpired last week. As such, Lavrov requested a response from individual nations to his letter rather than any multinational bloc or union. Of course, however, as we expected, the EU replied in unison on behalf of its 27 countries, and then 3 weeks later, the EU backed up its rhetoric with action by pledging to finance the purchase and delivery of $500 million worth of equipment for Ukraine, making it the first time in EU's history, I believe, of sending arms to a country that was under attack. Along with this effort, Russia has attempted to increase its global significance through increased high-level visits. So another tool in Putin's kit bag has been the Russian-dominated regional blocs, namely, as Dr. Wilcox mentioned, the Collective Security Treaty Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union. Both were created in an attempt to maintain economic and security ties between Russia and its neighboring countries in Central Asia and the Caucasus mainly after the fall of the Soviet Union. In recent years, Putin has attempted to broaden the geographic reach of CSTO specifically by offering observer status to countries such as India. However, the Secretary General of CSTO, as late as last month, warned against the expansion of CSTO lest it erode the solidarity and reduce the effectiveness of the organization. Slide, please. Leading up to last week's attack on Ukraine, Russia, as we all noticed, Russia increased its frequency and scope of military exercises, including with certain CSTO members. Part of its rationale for doing so, at least according to the Kremlin, was in response to NATO's so-called aggressive actions along the Russian border. Chief among these, I think, was Defender Europe, which was planned to take place in 2020, an annual large-scale U.S.-led joint multinational exercise designed to build interoperability and build readiness between U.S., NATO, and other partner nations. The United States, in order to decrease the risk of miscalculation and increase transparency, we actually went so far as to brief Moscow on the exercise before it happened. But despite these gestures of good faith, Russia still falsely claimed that these exercises were part of NATO's attempt to build combat power along the borders with Russia. And so they pledged equal reaction from CSTO. But despite Putin's efforts, his best efforts, however, CSTO continues to lack international recognition and the prestige desired by the Kremlin. Following the relatively quick actions taken in Kazakhstan to deploy peacekeepers, CSTO appealed to the UN to include their peacekeepers in future international peacekeeping operations. However, the organization still struggles to find legitimacy, even within its own members, partly due to the organization's lack of involvement during the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War, as well as multiple ongoing border disputes throughout Central Asia. So now the question becomes, what role, if any, CSTO will have in Ukraine? Obviously, at this point, it's not at the front of anyone's mind, but it could play into Russia's calculus down the road in an attempt to establish any semblance of legitimacy for its recent actions in Ukraine. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Dr. I. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colonel Aldaya, for very insightful information. Next slide, please. Before we start the most engaging phase of our session today, questions and answers session, just a few general points to consider, if I may. What is at stake? Response from West, NATO, would mean a loss or gain of credibility. No credible response would be a major win for Russia. Russia's win would likely bolster its appetite to expand its influence. It would affect the global and European security architecture, role of Russia, China, and their partners, potential for increased nuclear proliferation. Key questions. Can the West and Russia find a mutually acceptable compromise to save face? Or will we witness another major global conflict? Okay? Next slide, please. So now's the most fascinating, engaging stage begins, right? Please, the questions, answers, and comments. When you ask a question or make a comment, please use, for those who are sitting around these tables, their microphones, mics already up. You don't have to do anything. If you sit on those rows in the back, please use this microphone, because we're still video recording for if in the future it will be released for public. Okay? So one of the most frequent questions that was being asked before the invasion, Dr. I, was Russia going to invade Ukraine? Okay? So I told Russia not to invade Ukraine. But for some reason, they didn't listen to me. They said, Dr. I, go grow your hair first and then tell us what to do. Anyways, these kind of questions and the timing of the invasion, why now? Hopefully we can discuss during Q&A. Okay, but I was serious saying that there were so many questions until the last minute of this panel. I've been getting by email, I've been getting by phone calls. Everybody's interested in this topic. So now, floor is open for the audience. Yes, Mr. Piloni, the first question is yours.
Yes, my question is to Dr. Modinger.
Modinger.
Modinger, thank you. I've heard expressed that there's concern that China is going to offer some viable economic platform or financial system as opposed to SWIFT. And the theory would be that Russia would be able to jump to that and force everybody to deal with energy through that system. Is that more of an unrealistic fear, or is that actually possible?
Well, I certainly think it's possible. But of course, years ago, we heard the term BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Mm-hmm. And presumably they were working to create, among other things, a basket of currencies to challenge the conventional model of the US dollar being the reserve currency for the world. And when everything goes to hell in a handbasket in the world, people start buying dollars. This is a tremendous advantage to the United States. I mean, a tremendous advantage to the United States. One we would hopefully never lose, but we may lose. And the logic is compelling, because if you have a basket of currencies, it is akin to a mutual fund as opposed to a reserve currency, which would be an individual stock in some regards. Okay? So there's an offer of stability, if you go to a basket of currencies. But there are inherent dangers in that for the United States, especially given its deficit spending for so long. Okay? But I don't want to overemphasize that. To your point about something to parallel SWIFT in the future, I think it's a possibility. Certainly, as its economy continues to grow, and in all likelihood surpass the United States in the coming years, just in terms of size. I think it's a possibility. I think it's one we should do everything we can to discourage. You look at SWIFT right now, it's going to have dramatic impact on Russia. It is going to squeeze him like nothing he's ever felt since he's been running that country. And the longer this goes on, the more of a debacle it's going to become. If you have an alternative to it later, this gives him all kinds of option, and obviously we don't have the leverage that we have right now. And given that we've taken off the table putting U.S. forces on the ground in Ukraine, let alone a no-fly zone, if you take away the economic leverage, then it begs the question, what leverage do we still have?
Anybody else from the audience would like to add, or that was a question specifically directed to Dr. Modinger? I mean, so since there's no other, just a quick, the SWIFT access to interbank system by major Russian banks, which is 70%. There's still 30% is left, right? I mean, I'm not a financial expert, but I have a question in my mind. What about the 30%? Can they redirect those assets towards those 30%? It's just, central bank, et cetera, major banks are affected. So there's certain window is left, which is, and there's some other questions in my mind. I'm trying to ask financial experts and get the answers to them.
And the Russians did anticipate this years ago, that we would try and employ something like this. They did try and set up parallel structure. It's a dwarf compared to SWIFT, and even those mechanisms are not actually functioning in many ways the way they had hoped it would function.
So, yeah, just to follow up, so that's kind of a maybe not long-term, but an intermediate threat possibility as a response back to cutting them off of SWIFT. I think SWIFT will hurt them short-term, but they could recover medium to long-term if they can jump over to the Chinese system.
Just to quickly add, in addition to the SWIFT situation, right? So we know that Germany is not going to license Nord Stream 2. It's dead for now, right? But there is still Nord Stream 1, which has been functioning since 2014. And there is no discussion about that. There is still Turk Stream coming out of Gazprom, right, Russia, through Turkish territory. Nobody talking about that, right? And there is a Blue Stream coming out, natural gas. So there are certain windows left, and which is not, if I'm missing something, you can correct me, but that's what is situation right now is. Other question? Yes, sir.
I would just like to add something. My name is Peter. I'm a China specialist with the Foreign Military Studies Office. A few notes just to add to your question. In a letter published in Chinese media on 4 February in Chinese media, including Xinhua, Putin actually thanked China for its assistance in helping Russia develop alternatives. At the end of February, Chinese-Russian specialists were predicting that China would be able to weather the closing off of SWIFT due to these efforts. However, looking at the state of the Russian economy, those appears to have been inadequate, I think is fair to say the thing. So there has been coordination, and in fact on 5 February, during his meeting with Putin in Beijing, China and Russia actually signed a rather sweeping and very important joint statement that in addition to the publicized very comprehensive document which spoke on a whole range of things, including economic cooperation, and also deepening things that would be relevant to your point. There was also 14 other agreements signed. I haven't seen a description of what those were, but we can anticipate that was the case. However, the fact that China's own Russian experts got this wrong, or appear to have gotten this wrong, about the resilience of the Russian economy, I think that says something about the extent to which and the speed, and I'm sure that they're revising their estimates of how good the systems and the deep cooperation that they've had with Russia, which after all, to your point, did establish its own system in 2015. They were, again, top experts with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, their top academic institution, were saying that they had done this, and that was clearly not enough. So I think they're reevaluating, and I would bet that they double down.
Just a quick question for everybody. When you start speaking, if you please take your mask off. As soon as you're done, you can put it on back on. That would help everybody to understand clearer. And just a quick thing to complete. Anybody else from the panel?
Yeah.
You? Yes, please, Colonel.
Dr. I triggered me. Apparently bringing up the Nord Stream, I didn't anticipate that. Of course, Nord Stream, we brought that topic up, and also over the last days, Germany was rightly questioned a couple of times why we didn't launch the blocking of SWIFT earlier. And Dr. Modinger brought up a real important point. Well, there's some weapons we have which can only use once, and then they're done. And coming back to your question, sir, about SWIFT, of course, we can always bring up a new system to SWIFT, an alternative, but we cannot bring it up now. And in order to, the value of SWIFT is, like many things, it's the cooperation between many states and economies. And well, even if Russia brought up something, or China, whoever brought up something really fancy, it will take months, years, to many nations actually acknowledging it, using it. So I think, yes, we have an option in the future, but we have seen the option, and also the enemy has seen the option of what happens. And if something arises, it's easy to observe that because, well, we don't need military to do that. The economy will do that for us. They're really observing well. They're better than the military in that case. And bringing up Nord Stream, well, we have another weapon at hand right now. Germany has always, we have tried to explain why we are so fond of Nord Stream 2. Yes, of course, we committed a big mistake by not diversifying enough our energy demands that we need as an industrial nation. But still, cutting off Nord Stream 2 was a big decision for us, and keeping Nord Stream 1, well, think of it as a tool as well. Yes, it's going to be painful for Germany cutting it off, but so will it be for Russia. And when we're talking about the Cold War, well, energy, even in the hot periods of the Cold War, the energy from east to west was still flowing. So also Russia has a very big interest to keep that gas flowing. And for him, regulating the gas price, closing it down, is also a one-time weapon. If he does that, it's not only Europe who's going to stop buying. There's many other countries who will stop buying. I think that's another thought worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's such a great discussion. Anybody else from the distinguished panel? From the panel? Anybody else from the audience? Yes, sir. Introduce yourself. Ask your question, please.
Thank you, gentlemen. My name is Major Casey Brown. Before my arrival here in January on TDY-OC, I was the intel planner for European and Russia on the joint staff, and I had the privilege of briefing the defense attachés on this developing situation between September and the end of December when I left here TDY here. And sir, what you're speaking to about this shared pain is something that we spent a lot of time trying to convey to the NATO attachés, because it was very clear that Russia was very intent on doing this invasion through a number of different intelligence, which we shared most of it. And what was also really clear was how he was attempting to use the threat of gas as a weapon. And then I think by us doing the SWIFT option, it also, I think showed our resolve to, accept that pain and not allow Russia to dictate the terms of policy in NATO. So I just want to say I really appreciate how the defense attachés and your country in particular has stepped up and worked through that. I know we spent a lot of time working with the different partners to do that. And then going forward, I'm curious as far as how the CSTO will be leveraged. I saw today that there was a effort by Russia to introduce a concept called coordinating forces, where it looks like he's going to try to drag the CSTO countries into the conflict offensively, as opposed to just being a defensive measure, that they would be able to come in as some kind of like peacekeeping force into Ukraine. And I would just be interested in those thoughts as far as how viable that is. I mean, with the current CSTO countries already having rejected sending their forces into the engagement, I'm curious as how that would function.
Yeah, I'll take that one first, and
Yes.
then let Dr. Wilcox, and we'll get to your question. I know you've been sitting there, man. But yeah, so if you look at the comments from some of those CSTO members, they're very benign. They're definitely not supportive of Russia. I think I read how Kazakhstan denied being a part of that as well, and they're one of the, you've got Belarus and then Tajikistan, Armenia, and then you've got Armenia. It's got its own problems. I don't see how they'd be, wanting to get in somebody else's problems. And there is connection between the Armenians and Ukrainians, and that's another part, right? I mean, these are former Soviet Union countries. They going into another former Soviet Union country. I mean, just there's so much shared history there. I don't think that would be successful. But
Dr. Wilcox, have something to add?
Not much to add to that, would certainly concur. And even look at a country like Kyrgyzstan, who the CSTO failed to come in and intervene in when they had a civil war. I don't see them jumping on board anywhere and either.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Sir, please introduce yourself, ask your question.
Thank you. Major Gabe Kaczynski, Staff Group 8 Delta. I had two questions that seemingly are unrelated, but I think they get after the fact, obviously, there's been a fairly strong base coalition against Russia and Russian aggression here, but perhaps we're overlooking some other second and third order effects that might concern us. The first question I have relates to China. What do we think the Chinese motive for abstention was with the United Nations? And could this be tied to the Chinese Dream Agenda, as they might be pursuing to be the peace broker in this instance? The second question, unrelated to China in this case, and obviously anyone, this is for anyone to answer. The second question relates to the Azov Regiment, formulated in 2014, which has been actively recruiting internationally, using online forums, etc., and has an espoused neo-Nazi and far-right leaning. They're also conjoined in many ways to what's called the rights sector. Is it possible in this case, what kind of concern or mitigation should we have in this case in particular of second and third order effects as we deal with the issue of information warfare and how these groups are interacting, potentially training, coordinating with potentially domestic white supremacist groups within the United States and within Europe as well? Thank you.
Anybody would like to begin from the panel? Dr. Modinger?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and address your first question. I'll leave these smart fellows to deal with the second one. Why would China choose to abstain with regard to the shellacking Russia has taken in the last few days? I think it's fairly obvious that it's enjoying the rapprochement it's having with Russia. You know, when Nixon went there in '71, the goal was to split the Soviet Union from China and hopefully begin the demise of the Soviet Union. Arguably, it helped. But now Xi Jinping sees Putin as a necessary addition, I think, to frustrating America on the global stage, creating conundrums for the United States. And when the U.S. is dealing with those conundrums, arguably it's not able to focus as much energy and effort on things that are more central to Chinese interest, be it Taiwan, be it Xinjiang, be it trade, whatever the case may be, South China Sea. So that's why they abstained, to keep that unity with Russia. But the reason they didn't go with Russia goes right back to their own foreign policy. They can't be seen to be openly supporting one state's intervention in another state, because that would fly in the face of their own foreign policy, which is no one should interfere in the domestic affairs of another state, i.e., U.S., get the hell out of the Taiwan issue. U.S. policy says that Taiwan is but a part of China, yet somehow we've maintained this decades-long involvement there. The Chinese would call it interference in the domestic affairs of the Chinese state. I think there's something to be said for that, but I also think there are American interests at play here, and it serves American interests to have the Taiwan Relations Act and have that interchange with Taiwan. And the fact of the matter is, if it wasn't for the United States selling weapons to Taiwan, nobody on planet Earth would do it, because they wouldn't want to engender the ire of Beijing, which we've seen many times can be brutal when you get on the wrong side of Beijing in terms of economic sanctions and other things. Just ask Australia, for instance. Okay? So.
Thank you so much. Great discussion. Is everybody doing good so far? Is it interesting or complete nonsense?
Go ahead.
Is it something useful?
Be honest now, be honest.
Okay. I'm just trying to have an eye contact with my small eyes to see that everybody's doing well. So this is fascinating discussion, right? And nothing is more important right now internationally, in international relations, if you follow the media, etc. So any other questions from the audience?
Dr. I wonder if we
I don't
could
think he
deal
got
on the
the
second
second
question. There was a second
Oh,
question he had.
who would like to address the second question?
Well, after you made the thing about whether it's interesting or not, I'm afraid to answer, but I'll try.
Dr. Wilcox, the floor is
Though
yours.
that's an absolutely fascinating question, and I hate it when people say, what an interesting question, but it is. It's a really good question about the Azov Battalion and second and third order effects. Because, I mean, one of the points arguably is the presence of the Azov Battalion feeds well into the Russian narrative. Yeah, that's a bunch of Nazis. We have to denazify the country, and here's example number one, the Azov Battalion. I think it's interesting that I believe the Ukrainian government is trying to, I think they're looking, what's something, International Legion or something like that? The Ukrainian government is trying to recruit internationals through another channel, which would tell me implicitly that they're sensitive to this, and perhaps they don't want to be associated with the Azov Battalion as well. And perhaps the whole Azov Battalion is not as necessary. Because remember back in 2014, when the Ukrainian army was, I'll be diplomatic and say less effective than it is right now, the Azov Battalion and other battalions like it played a key role in the fight there. So it's a very valid point. I think the second and third order effects of the West particularly getting involved in any way with these forces would certainly not be good. And I think we're seeing potential alternatives on the Ukrainian side to try to get around that. And I'll say it, I haven't been following it this closely, but I just picked up these few data points.
Yeah, just to follow up
Anybody
on
else?
that for the Pravi sector, right sector, and then the Azov Battalion. So that came up, post 2014, where we were talking about major security assistance to Ukraine. And we, DOD immediately caught on to that, and they were essentially put on the blacklist. Obviously, it's very difficult when you're talking an entire battalion and people move around, but our government was very sensitive to that, and so we restricted security assistance to them, including weapons training and stuff like that. So we've been looking at that for, since 2014. But it's a great point. Information warfare is, pretty huge in this war especially. So.
Is anybody else from the panel?
Make a follow-up.
Is that answers your question, sir?
And I would just like to add with that, obviously there's other actors here as well. So the Russian separatist groups in Luhansk and Donetsk. And so I think what feeds to that, though, whether it's the Azov Regiment, roughly 2,700 fighters there, or whether it's the Russian separatists themselves, are we at a point that even if this conflict reaches a negotiation between Russia and Ukraine through some sort of settlement at some point in the future, are these groups actually going to abide to that settlement? Or are we running into a similar issue that you might have seen in places like Northern Ireland or other areas where now you have a sectarian contested area with prolonged conflict?
Anybody from the panel? Dr. Wilcox or Colonel Frank, please.
Okay, I'll just try to give it a shot. All those individual groups who are getting involved for whatever reason in those kind of wars, not assuming that they are all following maybe those intentions that we would hope they had, to say the least. I think as soon as you will only allow them that much space as they deserve, and when it comes to negotiation tables, there's always a chance of getting them into that realm as well. Just when we're looking at what happened in 2014, there was a format established with France and also Ukraine and Russia on the table, but also representatives from the People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, to also get those people involved in talks. So what can we do to prevent those minorities to dominate conflicts like that? I think it's about this information warfare you've alluded to. One part where the West is I believe, very weak because we're so depending on information that we jump on any information we can get. And we put a lot of emphasis on those very radical information we receive and then tend to blow it up and broadcast it all over the world. Even though we're talking about what you said, 2,500 people, yes, I don't want to downplay the size of those elements, but it's 2,500 people, nothing more, nothing less. If we allow them too much space in our information domain, well, then they are going to shape the conflict. So that's a task for the West, that we have to find a way how we can mitigate this risk and maybe focus on the values we have, not the ones that are divisive.
Dr. Wilcox, you had something to add? No? If I may, real quick. Of course, as a part of the Russian propaganda, the figure of Bandera, for those who are familiar with the Eurasia history, not just the Russian, but Eurasia history, so been very much actively cultivated. Bandera was a figure, nationalistic figure during the World War II, very controversial figure. Anyway, so that's kind of the major key concern. So they call them Banderovцы. Everybody is called Banderovцы. But that's not kind of unified situation. And at some points, some of the Ukrainian governments could not control, if you follow closely the internal situation in Ukraine, could not control all these groups, right? So, but as a parallel to the Second Karabakh War, if somebody's familiar with that, there would be opposition to President Aliyev, but when the war started, the people united with this patriotic wave of supporting the leadership. The same is happening in Ukraine now. The agenda for external adversary is common for everybody. So, but after it's over, and depending on the outcome, it has to be seen how this situation will play out, if that makes sense. Okay, any other questions from, I was trying to avoid the second question, but you didn't let me, but. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, Dr. Kim. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. After Dr. Kim will be you, sir. Dr. Kim, please.
I have a very simple question. What do you see are the off-ramps for Putin?
Could you repeat, Dr. Kim?
What do you see are the off-ramps for Vladimir Putin?
Okay. Anybody to begin with?
Well, I think he came out and said today things are going according to the plan, so I'm not sure he envisions any off-ramps right now. Yeah, I don't see any. I don't see that's even in his calculus right now, is looking for off-ramps. He's pressing on. So that's kind of my simple answer to that question.
Simple question, simple answer. Was a good question. Good question.
I believe it was this morning, French time. Putin had a discussion with Macron, and Macron walked away from that phone call saying, I think he's committed to take this right to the end. So we haven't even begun to see the worst of this yet, according to Macron. As far as avenues off, either the pain is going to get so substantial that they're going to have to look for some kind of face-saving measure for him to extricate himself from it, or you're probably looking at some kind of level of conflict in Ukraine of 10 plus years. Big drain on their economy, but more importantly, the economic sanctions will just obliterate the Russian economy, I would think. It may even be the case that they'll eventually start to sanction the oil to squeeze him in even harder. Possibly he can win, turn things around in Ukraine and get a better deal for himself, but right now it's not looking like that.
Anybody else from the panel?
Yeah, I mean, I think the
Dr.
off-ramp
Aldaya.
is really domestically for him, right? I mean, so you've seen the protests continue to grow in Russia. I mean, so I think that's a positive sign. And, you know, whether or not he's a rational actor at this point, I'm not really sure anyone can answer that, you know, without being in a room with him. So I would say it's, you know, domestically, it's kind of up to Russia at this point, I would say.
Okay, anybody else from the panel, please? Okay, Dr. Kim, that answers your question.
That's good.
Thank you very much for the question and thank you for the answer. Sir, introduce yourself.
Wayne Sylvester. Wayne Sylvester, TradeOut G2. My question for the panel is sort of related to the previous question in that There has also already been some indication that Putin is willing to escalate to de-escalate, viewing his nuclear capability as a means to break the West's resolve and unified approach to his attacks at this point. How does the panel see that possibility affecting our resolve and our approach to the panel?
Thank you very much. Who would like to begin? Colonel?
I'd like to, I'll try to answer that in that open environment here. So I think it is not surprising for the West at all that there's always a nuclear option for Putin. He stated that multiple times, and I think the West is tracking what their strategies look like when it comes to potential escalation to de-escalate. I think related to the last gentleman's question when it comes to what are Putin's options out, when we've been talking about NATO's center of gravity, for Russia, Putin is the center of gravity. So when we're talking about nuclear and this escalation, well, I think we also have to consider, well, what about the center of gravity? Does it have to be targeted from the West, or maybe is there also some internal targeting which might be an option out to this face saving? And now we have to look at not an individual, but at the nation, at Russia. So maybe there's a saving the face for Russia when the center of gravity shifts from the system Putin to system Russia. What do I want to say? I hope, and that's just me hoping, that there's many, many clever, intelligent people in Russia who are in power right now who prevent a single decision to launch a nuke, because then suddenly the involvement of NATO is not a possibility, it is assured.
Thank you so much. Anybody else from the panel? Dr. Wilcox.
I guess a couple of observations. One, it was interesting to see the photo of when he issued that order to Minister Shoigu and General Gerasimov, with Putin at one end of this extremely long table. I don't know if this is long. I think it was longer than the table that Macron had to sit across from. This amazingly long table, and they're like two little schoolboys sitting at the far end. And perhaps reading too much into it, but one could argue is this showing a bit of the distance between the Tsar and his advisors, or could be he is just so freaking terrified of getting COVID he doesn't want to go near anybody, and I think that's part of it too. But it was an interesting moment to see that, and as I've thought about the nuclear issue, and it would seem logical if he's going to do it, he would use one in Ukraine. But when I think about it, so what targets are there for a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine? I don't think there's any large concentrations of Ukrainian forces that would hit. So the next logical thing would be, are you going to destroy a city, an urban area, and kill how many thousands of people with a nuclear weapon? And is that really a choice he would make? Something I struggle with. And I think the whole issue of escalate to de-escalate, there's some controversy over whether that's really their doctrine. I mean, the nuclear doctrine is classified. In the G2 side, you probably see a lot more than I do, so we won't go any farther there. But I mean, in their open military doctrine, it's basically, unless it's basically threat to the territorial integrity, sovereignty of the Russian Federation, that's when they would envision usually nuclear weapons. Now, Putin could very well see, if there's a threat to me being the president any longer, that could be a threat to the sovereignty of the Russian Federation, and all bets are off. But I think at the end of the day, what it's starting to point out, and others have written this, so I won't say it's my brilliant idea. Once again, we in the West are going to have to go back to days of thinking about nuclear weapons matter. It's not just all treaties and we're happy and everything's being managed, and there's no possible way anyone would use a nuclear weapon. They start to matter, and we have to bring that into our calculus, in our defense and security calculus.
Thank you so much. Anybody else from the panel? Dr. Modinger.
Yeah, I mean, that was a big thing, all right, to start waving that around. Is Putin a political leader? Yes, but I think the argument can be made, he's at least as much, if not more, the head of a criminal organization. He's like a mob boss, basically, and the oligarchs are his henchmen. And at the end of the day, nuclear war is bad for business, and criminals are foremost concerned about good, continuing business and whatnot. Obviously, China's looking at all of this too, and it's not in China's interest for it to ever escalate to something like that. So I think China could see itself playing a major role as an intermediary in those negotiations to try and tamp it down. I don't think you could count on Europe to act in that role because it's seen as being in cahoots with the U.S., North America, and whatnot. So maybe China has a role there, but yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Strange days.
Anybody else from the panel to add? Okay. Any other, is that answers the question? Good to go? Okay. There is an answer. And we appreciate, I can see that the Colonel Wagner's team here from TRADEC G2, I know you were very interested to join us. We appreciate this intellectual curiosity. Thank you very much. So any other questions from this audience? It's much easier now without outstations, right? Just, I want to remind everybody, again, I know Dr. Kim mentioned that disclaimer. This is all our personal opinions and the moderators and the panel do not reflect U.S. government's opinions or respective government opinions, right? Everybody remembers that. Questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Sir, you first. And then who was the next one again? I saw the, okay, ma'am, yes, please. You are at the mic already.
Major Rachel Lawrence, Staff Group 16 Charlie. What impact do you think the implications surrounding the Budapest Memorandum will have on other nations to now seek to acquire and hold on to nuclear weapons to provide assurances against great powers such as Russia?
So to the panel as a whole, right? Anybody to begin with? Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Wilcox, please.
Sure. You know, it's a very relevant question because I think the Ukrainians may have some buyer's remorse about what they did. And I think it may have been an offhand comment that President Zelensky made to that effect, that Putin would jump on and say, "Oh, they want nuclear weapons. They're trying to acquire nuclear weapons," which is ludicrous. It raises an important issue because you look at potential places where you could have nuclear proliferation, particularly in the Middle East and in Asia as well, as people look at either threats from Iran or China. And for the West or other countries like the U.S. be able to step in and say, "Hey, no, don't get those nuclear weapons. We'll give you negative assurances," which is what the Budapest Memorandum was, where negative security assurances. We'll give you these assurances. Don't worry about it. And I think a number of countries would say, "Well, yeah, we hear what you're saying. We've seen how that worked out for the Ukrainians, and maybe that's not a route we want to take." So I think there certainly are potential implications for nuclear proliferation as well. And I think it's interesting too in the fact that if you get the Russians and the Americans together to give you an assurance, you can say, "Well, that's really good, but what happens when they don't like each other?" And even to the questions that are coming up in reference to the negotiations with the Iranians, where they're saying we want some kind of guarantee that the next administration isn't just going to walk away from this thing. So I think it definitely adds a good bit of ambiguity into how countries are going to look at either acquiring nuclear weapons. I'm not sure any of them are going to give them up that have them already. Even say the Indians or the Pakistanis, I don't think they're going to give them up either. But I think it certainly raises doubt, and I think there are certainly implications there. And for the broader validity of international agreements, do they really mean anything? Are they worth more than the paper they're written on?
Anybody else from the panel? Dr. Modinger, please.
You know, nuclear weapons are essentially the golden ticket these days. Many countries that have it now arguably got it, at least in part, because they were concerned about one of America's favorite pastimes over the last quarter of a century, regime change, okay? If you have the golden ticket, you kind of take that off the table. One wonders, would we have ever had Desert Storm if Saddam had a nuclear device in 1990-91? And if it had not been for the Israelis taking out the reactor a decade earlier and setting back the program, how might that have changed our calculus? Quite frankly, I don't think we would have ever had Desert Storm if he had a nuclear weapon. There would have been some other development or a way to maybe get through that struggle, but it wouldn't have been Desert Storm, in my opinion. This is why North Korea wants it. This is why Iran wants it. This is why other actors want it. This is maybe why Ukraine, or some people in Ukraine, are thinking back nostalgically to the time when they gave them up to the Soviet Union, and I believe some nuclear fissile material was transferred to Oak Ridge in the United States as well. Should they have done it? Or would that have been enough to keep Putin at bay? Now, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Okay, anybody else from the panel? Okay, the simple situation. Yes, ma'am, that answers your question. Yes. Thank you so much. As we said in our introduction, and the panel greatly articulated that, some other countries could ask a simple question: what we should do not to be in a situation of Ukraine in the future, right? So that's kind of the first question would come to other countries' minds, unfortunately. And that's what I said, nuclear proliferation is possible. Other questions, there was some questions from here, right? Maybe I'm mistaken. Somebody raised a hand. Yes, sir, please. Introduce yourself. Yeah, that was you. But after you will be the next, please. Yeah, introduce yourself, ask your question.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rodney Morris from the Department of Distance Education. First of all, I just want to thank you all for being here today. You've provided some great insight, and it's been very informative, so thank you. I'm kind of piggybacking a little bit on Dr. Kim's question. And Dr. John Modinger, when you presented, you talked about the will, when you talked about the Iraqi people and the Afghanistan army and people, and lack of will to pursue, to make a difference. There's no question that the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian army have the will. They're striving to achieve. That's very clear. No question about the leadership coming out of Russia and their will to accomplish their objectives. No dispute there. But I'm wondering about the will of the Russian people, and more importantly, the will of the Russian army as they're pursuing their orders and attempting to follow through with that. They're starting to see reality on the ground, the atrocities that are happening with their distant people. Could that affect this outcome, this off-ramp, possibly in the future with sanctions and other things that are going on? Could that change the dynamics of this, and could there be some uprising within that could change where this thing is going eventually?
Mm.
Yes, the question to the Dr. Modinger, please.
Yeah, I think it could, Rodney. It's obviously not going well at all for the Russian forces right now. What we've seen in Ukraine that we didn't see in Syria, and we haven't seen in some other dust-ups that the Russians have been involved with, is the scope of this is pretty big. And we're seeing a great reliance on conscript forces at this time. And the wherewithal of those soldiers and their situational awareness is just not there right now. You're seeing Russian soldiers running out of fuel and just pulling off to the side of the road and then going and asking Ukrainians either for gas or help or directions or whatnot. It's almost comical if it wasn't for the fact that people are dying as this is happening. You have other soldiers that are literally puncturing their gas lines and gas tanks, according to NATO intelligence, because they have no desire to do this. They weren't informed, a lot of them, that they were even going into Ukraine. Some of them, I think, are still under the impression they were inside Belarus as part of the exercises. This is just, the next phase of the exercise. So the reliance on conscript forces is a real drag on Russian military efficiency. You contrast that with like their airborne forces that are more akin to contract forces, like our enlisted force, okay? they're much, much better, much more dependable, and this is what the Russians use for a lot of those shorter type things. It's fast, it's efficient, they paid for it. This conscript force, you're seeing a lot of the negatives associated with reliance on a conscript force. And I think as these tails grow, it's going to further and further erode Russian military morale. And yes, you may start to see some blowback and what is possible for Putin going forward.
Anybody else? Colonel, please.
Yeah. I think that when we're asking about the morale of people or the motivation to fight of armies, and also extending it to the people of whatever nation, I think what the West has demonstrated successfully in the past 100 years, I would assume, we have never really got into the minds of another nation. We always struggle with that. We struggled when identifying or when assuming that the German Nationalist Socialist Germany would collapse because the army would not withhold and then people would collapse. It didn't. Japan didn't. We went to Afghanistan with quite some might, didn't understand what the people were doing, and well, we didn't succeed. So assuming that the Russian army is in turmoil or whatever, I think it's a dangerous assumption because we don't understand them. And currently they're still in the offense. It's going to be interesting when they're getting more into the defense, but the defense might as well play into their hands because, well, as soon as you're in the defense, you start defending your country. And I think what history has shown us when it comes to Russia, well, never awaken the Russian bear when you go into his country, never in winter and basically never in time, because the Russian people will then take up arms. So I'm hoping for inner turmoil. It would help us because it would maybe bring us peace, but I think it's just a hope because in the end, the few things I've encountered Russian people, they are patriots. They love their nation, and they're a proud nation. And whenever this pride is attacked, that will just infuriate them even more. Personal belief.
Anybody else from the panel? Yes, Dr. Wilcox.
Sure. Just a couple of data points, and on the Russian people and the potential for something happening in Russia. It's clear that the Ukrainians are trying to play that with their information campaign of interviewing prisoners, displaying photos of prisoners and dead Russians so that their families can identify them back in Russia. The prisoner thing, there's a Geneva Convention issue there, but that's something else. So trying to perhaps stir up some dissent within Russia as well. And another kind of interesting little data point, and it's really, really bizarre that they may be trying to indicate there are some divisions within Russia. It's the story of the Chechen assassins who were sent allegedly to kill President Zelensky. I mean, that's a bit bizarre enough, but believable enough story is in any way. But what's odd about it, when the Ukrainians presented, they said, you know how we found out about it? Someone within the Russian FSB, the Russian Security Service, told us. And it's like, wow, that's strange. That's really bizarre. But what they're trying to do is create the impression there's some dissident factions within the security services. There might be some fissures going on there. I'm not sure if it's true at all. It may very well not be, and I kind of doubt it right now. And so when it gets to the Russian people within Russia, Putin has developed a repressive apparatus that's incredibly effective and has just squeezed the Russian people so much. There's little opportunity for dissent, and certainly for organizing. You see how quickly it was great. Yay, anti-war demonstration, it's great, but the police were all over him right away. And I'm not sure how much stomach the Russian people have to get out and get beaten up and to get imprisoned that much too. But it's interesting. I saw something too that, even though it seems Russians don't like war, bad, people are dying, at least 60% still buy the narrative that no, this military operation was justified. It's the right thing to do. So I think unless the power structures begin to doubt Putin, the security services, the military, the internal affairs, it's going to be a long slog. And I think at the end of the day, maybe the off-ramp becomes the elections in 2024. And he just says, maybe it's time for me to go and enjoy my savings that are being frozen by the West right now, and find something else to do it. And he's convinced by someone with his own government, it's time for you to move on. Because that gets to the problem with a an autocracy like Putin's running, there's no succession plan. And that's perhaps the danger. We could say, hey, it would be great if Putin got, somebody threw him out. It's like, what happens next? Who takes charge? What's the situation in Russia? Do we get something that, a level of chaos that might be even more problematic? Rambling answer, apologies for that, just some random thoughts there.
Anybody else from the panel? Okay.
That
Is
answers
that answers
the
your
question,
question,
Dr.
sir?
I. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. If I may, since there's no other members, just real quick to add. Sometimes we apply certain things from the Western culture, American culture, exactly what is going to happen in other cultures. It's a fundamental mistake because the cultures and histories are different. So look, talking about Russia, Russian history, it's just enough to remember the time of Prime Minister Stolypin under the Nicholas II, and then the Bolsheviks came, what was the economic situation. The bottom line is that to think that if economy is worsens in the West, for example, that's a big deal. But not necessarily in other countries, right? So it depends on the internal agenda and how the leadership leverages that. Unfortunately, we tend not to understand other cultures. But looks like I've been following all these years very closely, of course, per my professional expertise and interest, how they are not really ignorant people. Putin, Gerasimov, Shoigu is a little bit different. He's kind of functional person, but yet he's not. So the bottom line is we shouldn't apply everything exactly how it would happen in this country or other Western countries. This is different. Now, in terms of talking about the security apparatus, if you remember several years ago, when there were protests in Russia, significant protests, and Putin created a special National Guard, which would protect him, and there were a lot of information about the main purpose of that apparatus, National Guard, to protect him in an emergency situation, kind of, for his power. So that's another aspect of it. So I'm just saying, for some of us who lived in Russia and the Eurasia for many years, even served in the army, which used to be called Soviet Army, right? I think I can clearly see that sometimes we are miscalculating. And the Middle Eastern culture the same. It's different. So hoping that this SWIFT or whatever we're taking, sanctions completely, make or encourage the Russian people to rise, it's probably too premature. Talking about the propaganda, every country has its propaganda as a part of its leveraging its international relations, right? A lot of things we are seeing on the TV might not be true. We just need to understand what is true, etc. Now, many of you have seen the scenes failing military campaign, initial military campaign of advancing Russian tanks, getting stuck in the mud. That's interesting because for whomever served in the Soviet military, we never even had the military drills during this transition from the hard soil, like till the spring when the snow is melting, because it's becoming very difficult for the military vehicles, tanks. Now, the tanks are advancing and the fuel is not being supplied. They're delayed supplying the fuel and even the food. So I don't know what's really going on, but remember what happened with Chechnya about 2 decades ago? They were failing in Chechnya. And then they regrouped and changed the tactics. What they are doing now in Kherson, in Kharkiv, Russians call it Kharkov, right? They are trying to use the same tactics they used 2 decades ago in Chechnya. They're completely eliminating the cities, essentially, without any select, is the civilian objects or military objects. That's what they did in Chechnya afterwards. The same they did during the 70s and 80s in Afghanistan. As a result, they killed 1 million people in the course of 10 years. So we just need to understand the things. So the bottom line, from the military perspective, to say something, how is Russia doing, it's too premature, unfortunately, in my opinion. It's just the first stage. We need to follow and see what's going to happen next in next stages. So, I mean, my simple calculation is they already took Kherson, unfortunately, that's my understanding, tonight. So by that, they kind of confirmed my kind of thinking that They're trying to connect Mariupol, Kherson with Crimea as a land corridor. And then they might start the military activities in Transnistria of Moldova. That way they can get the business finished and connect all these. And they don't need to go with 190,000 troops, unrealistic, through the entire country. They need to replace, from their perspective, the government in Kiev, and that's what they're advancing from, with pro-Russia puppet, essentially. And that would be, from their perspective, a done deal for now. So hoping that these sanctions will make Putin to back off, it's not a naive thing. He's not that kind of person, okay? So I don't think he's going to push it. 35,000, you call these paratroopers in the West, the Spetsnaz members, they're the best prepared to do this job, and they're already taking over the airfields. So just a quick addition to our very knowledgeable panel. Any other questions? Sir, introduce yourself, ask your question.
Sure. Okay, my name is Aldaya. I'm with the Dean of Academics. I have a question. So based on just what Dr. Wilcox and Colonel Frank said, and you talk about the comprehensive approach to the key, is the key to achieve the effective conflict management by improving coordination. You talk about and coherence in various conflict management instruments, and both in Brussels and Washington, right? The comprehensive approach become a major strategic.
Louder, please, louder.
Sure, has become a major strategic approach for the United States and European side, and the Lisbon Treaty, right? That we talk about. The ratification of the creation of the structure in this comprehension approach. And with the previous administration and current administration, before this current conflict, it seems like that the idea behind it is that US military is doing too much compared to what NATO is doing, right? And then this current conflict took place. My question to you is that what do you think would be realistic to achieve, in your opinion, to achieve a good course of action, given the current situation and what we just discussed, especially with your answer with the last two questions, what do you think would be a realistic approach to the current conflict?
Thank you very much. Anybody? And this is the last, we're getting closer to the end of the session. This is the last question, unfortunately. And again, before the distinguished panel answers that, the rest of the questions, please send to me. You will see the contact information that we can forward to the panel. Anybody would like to answer that question, please? Is it clear?
Go ahead.
I'll let Europe answer first. Oh, okay. If I understand your question correctly, you're looking at is this like for the United States and or Europe, a potential military course of action to take in the current situation?
So we talk about the comprehensive approach you talk about, right? And then also the US policy that was shifting during the Trump administration and the current administration would cause lots of concerns because the military budget and our involvement in Europe and NATO and that they're not doing as much as we are doing, right? So I'm asking you, what do you think would be a realistic course of action? Because the fact that we talk about nuclear power and the fact that we don't want to, for example, impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine because we don't want to see American and Russians. So what would be a realistic course of action?
Okay. First, I don't think a realistic course of action would be for the United States and NATO to be involved in Ukraine in the fighting. I think what we're seeing now is what needs to happen is, one, reinforcing and reassuring our allies. And I think it's interesting that discussions are taking place in Washington right now is, do we need to change our force posture in Europe? And I would not be surprised to see that force posture change. And I think particularly if you look at the potential threat from Russian forces remaining in Belarus now, not all of them going home, I think our allies there in Poland and the Baltic states are going to be looking for something a little bit more. And I think it's interesting that Secretary Blinken is on his way to Europe this week and will be visiting Brussels, Poland, all the Baltic states as well. So I think we may see some proposals there. Something else another answer would be like to spend your 2%. Thank you, Germany, for coming around to that. Is Europe willing to? How much is Europe willing to do You know, the French have talked about strategic autonomy for the European Union, some sort of distinctly, don't laugh over there, some sort of distinctly European capability. Is that the answer too? So, in short, I'm not sure what the whole package would be, but I think Europe and the U.S. are going to have to face up to the fact that the threat to Europe from the Russian Federation is different than it was, say, a month ago, and that we're going to have to take some measures. And that's why perhaps Europe's going to have to take up a lot of the slack, because the U.S. may say, hey, we've got this pacing threat. We got this China thing too. Remember, we were shifting over there? Well, since 2012, we've been shifting for 10 years. We really need to deal with the China threat as well, so there's got to be some understanding what's the division of labor going to be in terms of European security from a military standpoint.
Anybody else from the panel?
Yep.
Oh, Colonel, please.
Happy. As if I had pre-planned that. Thank you very much for that question, bringing me back to my dual-track approach. So, possible cause of action. Yes, absolutely. In order to talk to any peer threat like Russia, and for what it's worth, also China. For them, strength is of utmost importance to even talk to the people. So you have to have a strong military posture. You have to be the big guy in the room to actually be noticed. So we need that. And then continuing also using the other instruments of power, diversifying those instruments of power. And we always like to talk about dilemmas. We need to create multiple dilemmas. And actually military, we're never a dilemma. Military, we are a nuisance. We're creating an apparent threat. Everybody can pre-plan for that. But the other dimensions, they offer the real dilemma. And the last question has talked about the possibility of SWIFT, for example, being cut off and what the effects are. And I concur that the Russian people, I would assume that many of them are not yet feeling the pressure. But the Russian people in autocratic states like Russia, for example, are not really the power brokers. It's the elites. Yeah. And we've been talking about that earlier on. Just funny side effect to those SWIFT effects being created. Just imagine the wives of those oligarchs, the wives of all or the spouses of all those politicians and power brokers in Russia suddenly being stripped of their biggest hobby, spending. They're currently sitting at the French coast and being denied access to clubs, being denied access to their yachts, being stripped of their fun banking accounts, and they're pretty much sitting at home bragging and telling their husbands and wives when they come home, do something, change something. And I think that's an effect we don't have to underestimate, even though it sounds funny. But I think that's something you don't really realize how powerful that effect on the elite might be. So the dual track approach is something we have to really look into to create those dilemmas. That's maybe an option for the future.
Anybody else?
Well, I mean,
Yes,
not to be idealistic or whatever, but it's selling our brand in the West, you know what I mean? If you got, again, your choice between freedom-loving democracies or this Russia that goes and invades sovereign countries, I mean, it's pretty easy which side you want to be on, and I think we need to continue doing that through the whole government approach. And then also, I'm sure the Pentagon, along with, our NATO members, are talking about the troop situation as well, so.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Hey, Dr. I, so it's Mike Johnson.
Mr. Johnson, please.
I know we have 4 minutes left, so
Yes.
I apologize. But to your point, what I can't understand is, since we're so adamant of not putting boots on the ground, is it really in NATO's best interest to have the perception of bringing Ukraine into it? If we're not willing to even defend now, you would have to under Article 5, right? And so, is NATO really serious? And if they weren't serious, couldn't we have just precluded this from happening? Like, I know the doctrine says we'll allow countries to choose, but that may not be in NATO's or the world's security best interest. And I think it's playing out right now. And that's kind of my commentary on that. I get your point, but sometimes we have to be able to adjust and look at that, because I'm not sure the people of Ukraine or Russia are going to be served by what's going on right now across the board. And there was a possibility possibly to alleviate it by acknowledging the issues that are out there. And that's my personal opinion. I don't know what you think of that, because you were right in the middle of it.
Anybody would like to reply to this
I'm not
comment?
going to talk about countries coming into NATO. That's not a topic for me. Germany, though, maybe you guys
Colonel
want to talk about
Frank.
that.
I'm just raising another thought in this one. the strength of any alliance we have right now is we adhere to rules. We have an agreement to follow some standards and procedures, and I think it's important to realize that, especially as the West, as we base our strength on all those values and following those rules, even in times of conflict, we must not deviate from those rules because those are our strength. So if we suddenly just be very proactive and just start biting in all directions and forgetting all our rules, maybe as in NATO, just doing some ad hoc movements, that I think that would create rather a weakness, not a strength. And NATO has shown, even though Ukraine is not a member of NATO right now, all the actions initiated by NATO in support of that operation is a clear sign that NATO is highly committed and highly interested in its Euro-Atlantic area. And so I wouldn't see it as a real problem right now. NATO is highly committed and shown that.
Is that answers your comment, Mr. Johnson? Yes, Dr. Kim, and then you, sir. But we are getting closer, sir. Yes, Dr. Kim, you
I hear
first.
you, but that has not been the policy. The EU has for years declined to consider Turkey for the very same standards. And so I'm not sure that answer sounds good and idealistic, but I think if you're a Turk, you would say that's not true.
So, yeah, the question was, for years, Turkey has been considering membership. Why did it didn't? So that's the question. Anybody? Colonel Frank.
If I understand you correctly, you're applying the veto or the denial of the European Union to accept Turkey?
Yes.
And you're applying that to Ukraine entering?
I'm saying that the idea that you have rules and you would be open and you allow people to come in, the Turks have for years tried to go into EU, and I think there's been an implicit bias against the Turks ever joining the EU. And many of it's the same countries that are in NATO with the same set of rules that have not been adhered to for EU membership.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I do know that also the European Union, unfortunately, has many rules, and one of those rules is that they are based on consensus principle, and as long as another country is in the European Union that has some serious concerns about Turkey entering the European Union, there's no chance that they can. So it is, again, following the same set of rules, even though it's maybe not values-based, but they follow their procedures.
Okay. So we will.
I'll roll in real quick. Just one last comment.
Dr. Wilcox.
There's no way I can let this go.
It will never end as we usual, right?
I think
this is great discussion. Yes, Dr. Wilcox,
what the alliance ended up doing was put Ukraine in the worst possible position. They put him in NATO purgatory.
Yes.
You're not in, but you're going to be in sometime with a very open-ended commitment, and that was that helpful. But I think if we look at the current situation from that, we in some way buy into Putin's narrative. And I'm surprised this hasn't come up in a question. What about the promise that NATO would never expand, not 1 inch to the east? And recent scholarship looking at the documentary record and the record of participants shows no such promise was ever made to the Soviet Union, never happened. So I think we need to be careful buying into that particular narrative. And it's also worth noting, the crisis between Russia and Ukraine wasn't started because of NATO. It was because of, I'm going to blame it on the EU. It was because of President Yanukovych's decision to walk away from an EU association agreement. I think in some ways, so I think we need to be careful with that particular narrative about the whole NATO enlargement piece.
Just real quick, it comes back to the nuances of the culture. I think the key remains historically, if somebody gets to from Russian perspective, close to the Russian geographical borders, be it security alliance or in terms of the Western economic alliance, so that's when they become sensitive. So then the reaction begins. So I think we can stop here if you don't mind, if the audience doesn't mind, right? So if you have more questions, let me give you the contact information, right? Next slide, please.
That's right.
So this is the time to wrap up the session, right? So this is some of our capabilities and the active partners across the country and globally. Next slide, please. This is the final slide. Contains our contact information for any related questions, right? These are the links to CASO website. The event is being recorded, video recorded, and may be available via the CASO website in the future. when it's cleared for release. If it does, if it is, then we'll let you know, okay? So, on behalf of all of us, I would like to thank our, I want to say great panel as always. It's really, I mean, we are lucky, very knowledgeable panel for sharing their great and their insightful expertise with us. Thank you so much. This concludes our session. We look forward to seeing you again soon. So by the next session, our knowledgeable panel will solve all this crisis. We have 2 more months to go.
All right, that was fun.